February 3rd at 6:30 is now, is open, and we want to call the roll.
Milford?
Yes, here.
No?
Here.
Ms. Hallett?
Here.
Mr. Sprecher?
Here.
Ms. Ryan?
Here.
This is not our normal board meeting. This is a workshop, and I want to introduce Pat McNeese, and she's going to go through part of the announcements and presentation here.
Yes. Good evening, board members and public. My name's Pat McNeese. I'm the principal planner and acting director for Planning and Zoning Department. And we're here, as you know, this evening to talk about the update of the National Register and Local Historic District Design Review Guidelines Manual. That might be the only time I say the whole thing. Basically, this is being done with the help of actually completely funded by a state grant from the Department of State, Florida Department of State, and we are looking at finishing this project. That grant was provided last fall, and we're looking to finish this project by the summer. We have a lot of handouts available and things available for you. If you saw the table at the entrance, there's sign in. You can put your email if you want to be on an email list for regular updates. Go ahead and check that box, and we will put you on the email list for updates on this project. We do have some extra copies of the design guidelines. The draft outline that was attached to the agenda is also out in the lobby as well. There's some maps out there. We have extra copies of the Land Development Code section that goes with this. So tonight you will be giving your input. Hopefully we're going to hear input on ideas for the design guidelines and the update of those. You can also join the email group. You can provide comments to our email, comment email, which is planning@ctsfl.us. My cards are out there. You can take one of my cards if you have any questions or need all that information. I'll be glad to help you with that. We have comment cards out on the table for you to fill out if you want to use that. You can provide comments at any time. We'd like to get pretty much the bulk of the comments by the 21st of February, so we really have direction to take off with a draft document, or first draft document. So that's about 3 weeks from now, so written comments are best. We will be taking notes tonight, but really like to get as much input as we can. And with that, I would like to introduce our consultants from JMT, Sarah McLaughlin and Caitlin Hernstad, and they will be presenting just a short presentation, and then we'll go right into the workshop.
Okay. Hi, everyone. If you can't hear me, just let me know. I'm going to try and face this way, but also know what's going on behind me on the presentation. It's a very quick presentation, just to give a little bit of background about Caitlin and myself, our company, and what we're doing. So
Please make sure that mic's turned where we can hear it, because some of the board members are
Okay.
hard of hearing.
okay, is that better?
Much better.
If I do this, I just don't want to be, I don't know
That's
who I
fine.
should be addressing.
Just as long as we
Okay.
can hear you.
Sorry. Okay, so behind me, this is Caitlin Hernstad. We are both up on the screen. We both have master's degrees in historic preservation. What that means is we are qualified by the Secretary of the Interior to do these kind of projects. This is not a project that just anybody can do. There are regulations set by the federal government that says we have the background and the experience and the education to do this kind of stuff. So rest assured, we have that, and we will do our best to get you the design guideline update that you all need and want. And a little bit about the company that we work for, which is it's actually an engineering firm. We have a cultural resource group within the engineering firm. We do a lot of support work for our civil engineers doing Section 106 work. I'm actually just gonna go through there. A lot of transportation projects and a lot of bridge projects, we do support them, but we also have our own group where we do a lot of design guideline work. We do National Register nominations. We do large-scale surveys of counties and municipalities and go around and create inventories for these individual municipalities and give them an idea of what sort of historical inventory they have as buildings. We do historic resource management plans, all kind of stuff that cultural resource management employees do. The company itself is 100% employee-owned. It was founded in 1971. The company is actually based out of Maryland. Caitlin and I do not sit in the Maryland office. We travel all over the country doing work in different places, which is a very nice and a good way to see the country and learn about architecture and the stuff that we love in all different areas. And again, we are qualified for these positions as outlined by the Secretary of the Interior. Let's do these. I'm just going to read through this really quick. For those of you that, if in case anybody is not familiar with design guidelines, exactly what they are and what they provide. So during the design review process, the owners of locally designated landmarks and districts must get approval for the locally appointed Preservation Commission or Architectural Review Board for major exterior alterations, additions, and new constructions. This often comes in a form of a COA or a certificate of appropriateness. And to be approved, an application must meet the design review criteria that is set within the preservation ordinance that the community has adopted. The ordinance is the law, and the design review criteria or the guidelines are part of that law. The design guidelines are just that, they are guidelines. They are there to help people that live within the district that want to take on a project on their property. It is not hard and fast. It is not, you are getting this and this is what you have to do. They are not the law, they are guidelines in order to keep the overall aesthetic of the district and the houses and, you know, ultimately the economic benefits of that area higher is what the goal of the design guidelines are. They are helpful, interpretive, explanatory recommendations consisting of a combination of written and graphic information, using a lot of local examples. We're not going to come in and give you design guidelines with photos from Somerville, South Carolina, where we just did our last design guidelines. Everything is going to be with local examples and local styles. It's all about Tarpon Springs, nowhere else. So right now, I don't know if everybody has a copy of the guidelines, but I'm just going to kind of walk through these pretty quickly about what basically the table of contents is, which is a pretty standard format as far as the order things go in. It will start with an introduction into preservation in Tarpon Springs, the procedures, meaning what do I need to do to get my COA? Is there a form I have to fill out? What meeting do I have to go to? All of that. So anybody that lives in the district that may or may not know that information, that's all going to be in there as well. There will be a chapter about architectural styles that are existent within the district, which right now there is that in the current guidelines. It's not extensive. It does not include all of the different styles. So we want to make sure we are including all of the different styles. We're using a survey report that was done previously to complement the existing list in the design guidelines. Then we come to the bulk of the document, which is the design guidelines. That's going to be the biggest part of the whole thing. It's going to talk about windows, it's going to talk about doors, it's going to talk about finishes and porches and outbuildings and fences and all of that kind of information. We have appendices, which are there obviously to help everybody a little bit more that may not have the architectural knowledge. So if we use words in the guidelines that are not familiar to everyone, there's going to be an appendix with that. There's going to be an appendix that has more information about substitute materials. And we like to also include the actual ordinance itself in there, as well as a bibliography in case anybody has any further questions or wants to know where we pulled any of our information from. I didn't go super deep into detail. Again, the outlines that I believe were on the table have really what specifically is proposed for each chapter, this is the working outline that we're starting with. So we want everybody to kind of take a look at that and give us your feedback on that. But other than that, we're ready to just kind of dive in and see if anybody has any comments or questions and go from there.
Before we start that, on the public input, I would like to limit the speakers to 4 minutes each. No repeat speakers until everyone has had a chance to speak, and then if we have time, we may go back to some additional questions. Does anyone have a comment or a question they would like to ask? Please come forward. State your name.
Good evening. My name is Cindy Terrapini. I live at 22 North Spring Boulevard. I'll try to keep it for 4 minutes. I'm not sure I can get to that, but I will try. As many of you know, I've been a planner for over 38 years, not just in historic preservation, but other fields in planning. I've also served as the executive director to the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, the statewide preservation organization. I served as a member of the National Review Board for the state of Florida. So I have a good bit of experience in preservation. I also have some hands-on experience renovating our house and historic buildings we own downtown, as well as I was fortunate to serve with many of you on this preservation board. So I came to it with that perspective, but more importantly, I came to looking at this with the perspective of a homeowner who wants to do a specific project. How does he navigate these design guidelines and find what he needs to know? Not everybody's going to do everything in the design guidelines. In fact, they probably won't. They're going to do one small part of that. So I'll just go through my comments in general. I'll try and make it brief. I'll skip over some of this. Chapter 2, I just suggest that there's a lot of people to talk about in the city about the private efforts for preservation. Just encourage the staff and the consultants to do that. Chapter 3 is proposed to be the procedures manual. I greatly support the idea of a procedures manual. I think that is wonderful, but I strongly encourage you not to adopt it as part of the design guidelines, because what inevitably happens is that changes are made in the process or your application form or something else, and then that doesn't get changed in the guidelines, and so you have the ordinance that says one thing and the guidelines that says another, and people get confused. And I also come to this almost all of my career has been administering zoning codes and comprehensive plans in local government. So I know how it works every single day. I've sat in Pat's shoes trying to figure out how to help applicants through, and sat in y'all's shoes and doing that. So I just say to you, do a procedures manual, but make it a separate document. And then, as I said, I really thought about how would an applicant use this and how will you use this, because you're going to have a project to do one thing. So how does that person figure out and navigate the guidelines? And my suggestion is that you revise it to kind of this overall format, and I'm on page 2 of my memo. I would suggest that chapter 4 needs to be the guidelines that apply to everything, the secretary's standards, any of those general rules that apply everywhere. And those are things like preserve first, renovate second, replace at a completely last resort, create new as the last resort. You know, you kind of set out the philosophy. Then I would suggest that chapter 5 should be the guidelines for residential and commercial historic buildings. If that's what you're doing a renovation of your property, you would go to chapter 5. And then there's some, it would be broken down obviously in a couple different sections. Then I would suggest that chapter 6, and I think this summary of architectural styles is a great idea because people need to know what are the character defining features of that style? Something that's not really a most important feature of the style, you can probably be more flexible on. The most important features of that particular style, you want to hold the line on and be, fairly serious about, those changes to that. Then I would suggest that Chapter 7 is new construction and relocation. Whether if someone's building a new building, maybe they're building an accessory building in the back, maybe it's a whole new construction, but all the new stuff, anything new that someone's building, that's a whole separate, its own category. And then Chapter 8 is kind of the cleanup category. That's all the stuff that I know we used to kind of really suffer through because we didn't really have anything in the guidelines on how you do with pools and pool cages, what do you do with hurricane shutters, what do you do with solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of my overall suggestion. I have a couple other comments at the end, but I would just leave you with a couple things. One, make sure the language is easy to understand. We're not all architectural historians, and I appreciate what y'all are doing, but that's not the typical homeowner. They are not going to be an architectural historian. Second thing is, I know one thing we struggled with all the time on this board is when is window replacement okay? It has to do with whether it's a historic structure or not, obviously, but how much damage is okay before you can are allowed to replace. And the guidelines right now are pretty vague. And then the last thing I would suggest is that there be some language, whether you call it best practices and you say what can be done, or you say recommended or not recommended, something like that to make it really clear after you state the requirement what is acceptable or not acceptable, or recommended or not recommended, something like that, so that it's really clear to people. If you're asking something that's not recommended, the person knows in advance that they're going to have an issue and a problem with the application. And my last just comment is that if perhaps you're going to get this at some point, but I'd like to know what the next steps are. You're going to post a draft online. Is there going to be another workshop? I'm assuming there will be to review. If we could just address that at some point, what the next steps would be. And I thank you for your time.
Okay. Would there be anybody else who would like to speak?
Hello, my name's Carrie Root. I'm a resident of the local historic district, 203 South Spring Boulevard. First, thank you very much for holding this workshop. I think it's long overdue. We've watched many, many buildings go by the wayside. Many buildings get changed, and it's happened for a lot of reasons. Documentation's a big part of it. The first thing I want to say in general to the city is thank you for stepping up recognition that we do have national and local historic districts through the street signs that have been put up. Thank you, Mark. And I hope that those street signs go to every block that is touched by that special designation. And I also hope the city looks ahead to go ahead and put those same street signs up where we have a national cultural district. Most people are surprised to hear that we actually have the designation of natural cultural district, and our map does not indicate that. So I would ask that going forward with the map that was that handed out in the back? Yeah, that the National Cultural District is also added onto that. Just as a question, how many of you knew about the National Cultural District? There you go. All right. Which leads me to part of the guidelines. We can have the best guidelines in the world, and while maybe the guidelines that we've had are not as up to date as they could be, they are guidelines, but if they're not enforced and they're not enforced consistently, they're not useful. So we can put a lot of energy into new guidelines, but we have the same problem. They have to be enforced, and they have to be enforced consistently. Let me give you, I forgot to give you my background. I'm a member of the National Historic Trust. I'm a member of the Florida Historic Trust. I've been through CDL training through the Florida Historic Trust. I've served on the HPB board for quite a few years, and I've also served as chairman of that board. I saw a lot of things in my tenure on the HPB. The first thing is that if we're going to go ahead and put guidance material in these guidelines and history and other things that maybe don't directly relate to a decision made on how you change a building, be it in that document or a supplemental document, I would ask that you consider adding the following information. The first is guidance on the experience that a city manager or a city HR manager should have when looking for people to support the Historic Preservation Board. Second, it's difficult always to find people with that sort of background. So if they're not able to find that, I think it would be very helpful for our historic preservation experts to indicate where appropriate training could be obtained from the people from the city that support this board. The third thing is we often draw from our citizens who may or may not have the experience needed to effectively administer the decisions. I mean, this is a decision-making board. When I was asked to be put on it, my first thing was, well, I haven't done this before. I live in the district. Where can I go for education? And that's why I became part of the Florida Historic Trust. I took their training where it was offered. I did that on my own dime in my own time because I made a commitment to understand what I was getting into. And I think that one of the criteria that should be put onto people that serve on this board is a willingness to go get educated. The next thing is I think it's critical to have a scorecard. We need to assess where we are because that map that was put out is not up to date with regards to the state of the properties. The next thing, we need education of our commissioners. I've watched good decisions made by the HPB get turned over again and again because they were not educated or knowledgeable of what historic preservation really is, and you can't have an effective ordinance if it's not enforced. And then, again, on Chapter 2, I encourage you to include our National Cultural District. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please try to stay within that 4-minute guideline.
Good evening. Anita Protas, 901 Bay Shore Drive. Historic preservation became very important during my term as commissioner and as mayor. And we worked very hard on it. We worked closely with the citizens in the community and in the districts. My concern is that the City Commission doesn't fully understand the Historic Preservation Board. I'm sorry they didn't support your decision on the church. It was wrong. 3 commissioners voted to let them have what they wanted. It's interfered with the beauty and the historic preservation and the historic document of St. Nicholas Church. After that meeting, when I called Tallahassee and spoke to different departments up there, they agreed that it should have stood firm. You need to have a meeting, and I'm going to ask the city manager to offer a work session so that they will understand where you were coming from. The community supports you, the Greek community supports you on that decision that y'all made. It's caused quite a controversy, but it's over with now. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank Commissioner Carr, who did some extensive research on the historic preservation and stood with y'all on that decision. The Ethics Commission was concerned about the vote that was made. I don't know if they'll ever do anything about it. They usually don't, but it was reported. And I think it's very important what the 2 previous speakers spoke about, having it documented so people can read it. And I want to thank you for your time and say every decision you've made that has been overturned, you were right.
Thank you. Do we have another speaker? Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Okay. And the public input is now closed. And does any of the board members have anything, questions or comments they would like to make? I have a question for whoever presented this. I don't know which one of you can answer it for me, but, and maybe Pat, I'm not sure. You have to forgive me, I'm not really sure where to go with this. When someone buys a property in the historical district, I noticed on my property appraiser's website, my property says, no, it's not in the historical district. And I want to know if when someone purchases a home in that historical district, is that buyer made aware that it is in the historical district and what the guidelines and concerns may be for them for purchasing a property in a historical district?
I don't know for Florida. That's always a question that I have every time we go do this. Where I live, it's on a disclosure sheet, whether or not the house is in a historic district, so that's a state. I don't know if it's a state-by-state thing or a municipality, but
Okay. Pat, do you know the answer to that?
Yes, there's no note, the city does not notify people that they're in a historic district. In other words, we don't track property sales, you know.
So as far as real estate agents
yeah.
or appraisers' notes, it doesn't go in that loan package for them to know that they
Oh,
are purchasing
well,
in a historical district and that there
yeah,
are guidelines
that,
for
I don't know. I would say
Okay.
that would be the buyer's due diligence to research that, just like they would
Anything
research whether the
Okay.
house had all its permits or anything else. Now, when you say, as far as the property appraiser, if the property has some exemption, some level of exemption based on it being historic, that might tip a buyer off that it's in the district, may not necessarily be in a district, but other than that, they would have to seek that out themselves.
Another question that I had, or a concern, there are a lot of people that are elderly that have purchased a home years ago that is historic, but now, for economic reasons, are having difficulty renovating it or bringing it up to restore that historical building. And there was some mention of there are grant funds and other opportunities to raise funding for these residents or business owners to restore it to what it should be. Does the city planner have that information to be able to give to the applicants as they come in and say, hey, I'm in a historical district and I've got these problems going on and I'm economically strapped, so what can I do before I bring it to the Heritage Preservation Board? Are there any grants? Are there any of this? Is that something that the planner's office does or can do?
The city offers an ad valorem tax exemption program where improvements made to a building that result in an increase in the property value by the Pinellas County property appraiser, they can be relieved of the taxes on that increase for a period of 10 years. We have had two, they weren't elderly, low-income individuals, but we've had at least two since I've been here take advantage of that. So we do let people know about that. And as far as grants, you know,
How
there's,
would a homeowner find out about historical grants in this area? Is it something that goes out in a memo or public information for them to be able to locate that easily?
actually, yeah, I mean, they could call us, and in the planning department, we could see if there's anything that might apply to their project. Obviously, commercial projects that are in the CRA, there are facade grants available and those types of things. Actual grants for,
Residential too?
for no, not in that program, but grants for residential are tougher to come by. I'm not sure that there's even a state level.
Okay.
I don't know if Sarah would know of any grant programs,
Thank
even
you,
at the
Pat.
national.
Is there any other comments from the board?
When we make these guidelines, if the guidelines are for the historic district, but there are various ages and, in the historic district. I mean, that everything should be classified the same seems wrong. I mean, there are homes that were built in 1890, and there were homes that were built in 1960. And as it stands now, we're judging them all at the same. They're all falling into the same guidelines that we've got.
Let me take a stab at that, and then maybe Sarah can answer too. If you look at your design guidelines, each architectural type has its own
Does.
guidelines. Now, there are architectural types that are missing from the current guidelines. The 1950s, ranch being an example, not in there. The minimal traditional that you guys dealt with, it's not in there. Those are the kind of things we want to round out, but the standards are different for different styles. So when we look at the style you're looking at for whatever it is, a roof or siding or windows or doors, we look at the guidelines. We look at the page in the guidelines that talks about that architectural style and what's appropriate. So, and I think, I can let maybe Sarah add to that, but that's something we're looking to round out in this update and expand that.
But our guidelines do state whether it should be approved or should not be suggested, and it also states in those guidelines if there is some type of exception or a workaround, it states that too. It gives specific details of how to approve that.
Yes, so.
But I agree with Pat, there are certain things like the docks, whether it was in the historical site or not, and how docks can be looked at, whether or not they have a covering, a roof on it, or not have a roof on it. Mm-hmm. And those things, I think, need to be included in this.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're looking for from you all and from the public is, what do you want to see in this document?
Well, I think a prime example was the Greek church and that bookstore and all the controversy about it. And, we were limited in what we could vote because of where it was and when it was built. But it didn't have an architectural style.
It did have an architectural style, but it differed from what the church was. They needed Byzantine, and they were wanting to renovate this into Byzantine, and it was not a Byzantine structure. So that meant it went against the Secretary of State guidelines, which would mean no, which is what we voted, no.
Yeah, and the purpose of this is really, that was an individual case, but most of what you guys look at, 95% of what you look at, the people do, and they come before you, and you approve, or some of them you've sent back. Pretty much most of them, they do comply with what you're looking for. And so what we're looking for at this workshop is, where have you seen the issues, like the boat dock? Do you
But on the wall issue, I can't remember the case, but there was a case with the wall issue. We weren't given clear enough instructions in there to whether approve or disapprove, and that was kind of a judgment call, and we may or may not have made the right call on that one.
Right, for a site wall.
Yes.
So some of those features that are noted, for example, on the site file form for a property.
Say that again, Pat.
That are the features that are noted on the site file form for a specific property. It's not just limited to the building, right? Sometimes it's the site wall or an outbuilding or some other feature. Those are all things that you look at that you might want to see more standards or clearer guidance.
Same thing on porches.
That's
one of the porch.
Okay, that's what we're looking for.
So if I could just kind of go back a little bit. The purpose of putting the architectural styles in the design guidelines is to identify what's present in Tarpon Springs and provide character-defining features so everybody knows what to look for. The way the actual bulk of the guideline chapter or chapters are written is more, it's kind of more on a macro level. We're not gonna say, you know, you always have to replace something with X kind of roof because that's what was on, you know, a Victorian house, or X kind of window because that's what's in a ranch. A lot of times you'll see the verbiage in kind. So you want something that's similar to what was there previously, if what was there previously was historic. So it's not, we're not looking at one house style from one period and applying that to all of the guidelines throughout the document. It's more of an in-kind. When you're looking to replace a door and you have a Victorian, maybe don't go to Home Depot and buy the first, you know, fiberglass front door that you see. You need something that's going to fit with the style of the house. So the design guidelines themselves are not written in a way that they're constantly referencing one style of architecture. It's written so that regardless of what style architecture your house is, these are still gonna apply. And we do often put in, for instance, I think Cindy, you had mentioned this, like, this is the best case scenario. If you can't do this, then do this. This is better, and then this is what you don't want to do. We try to put that in, not for every instance throughout the guidelines, but we do try to put that in certain, especially with something like windows that is a hot topic regardless of where in the country you live. That's always going to be, you know, the best case scenario is replace, you know, wood windows with wood windows. Next case scenario is this, next case scenario is this, because it's really, we want to provide the residents and the board with a document that's really going to guide them and help them. The purpose of the document is to make the process easy for everyone. The last set of guidelines that we did were was for a town that didn't have design guidelines. They had had a historic district since the 70s, and they had never had design guidelines created. So they were just working off of the Secretary of Interior standards.
So in that Secretary of Interior standards where it says you cannot take one architectural style of building and transform it into a different form, that is in the Secretary of Standards, and that has to be a no,
Right,
correct?
right, and that's, I mean, the guidelines are in complete accordance with the
Okay.
Secretary of Interior standards. They are to go together. They are not one versus the other.
Okay.
They abide by those standards.
There was another question I had, and I'm trying to recall that, so just give me a minute. If anybody else wants to speak or ask a question, comment, please.
I've got a question. When it comes to a lot of the things that we face as far as hurricane standards and how historic properties kind of fall into that, you know, where do you draw the line? I mean, if you've got somebody that your insurance company wants you to have a hurricane-type window, how do you tell that person no? Or you were looking for something energy efficient that, you know, will give them, you know, a lower, you know, electric bill. How do you work cases like that are kind of, you're talking about somebody's pocketbook?
Yeah, and it's not easy by any stretch. This is the first location that we've worked in for design guidelines where hurricanes were as big of a concern, and that then brings into the issue of insurance, which is, you know, we have to do research on our end to kind of really figure out what is going to be the best guidance to give there. No one wants to be unreasonable. Ultimately, the point is to try to preserve the house and the district because it's better economically, it's better aesthetically. Like, there's a lot of different reasons for preservation. The wood windows versus, or the historic windows versus new windows, it's unfortunately wood windows are expensive, or refurbishing existing wood windows is expensive. But if your wood windows are good and fit properly, they are very energy efficient, which I think a lot of people don't know that. But I have a problem when people just want to take them out and just go, again, to Home Depot, Lowe's, and just get whatever white vinyl off of the shelf. There are other options that aren't wood or aren't white vinyl.
I would just like to have, some kind of teeth in it so that we can support that, because I think we're all on the same page.
There was an expert that came to one of our board meetings that did give other options for these homes. Some of them were Kevlar screens that would go on the windows to
Yeah,
protect,
yeah,
and
it
other
was the
things. That she had quite a few options to help that homeowner make some better
And it's
choices to
not just
preserve it.
about the hurricane, it's also about energy efficiency,
I know.
which is what a lot of people come at you for. If we could just have some guidance in that, just to help us when making those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another issue that I would like put in here as more of a guideline. When someone purchases a property that's in a historical district and it's already in bad shape, and they sit on that property for years on end and do not do anything to restore it or to try to do anything for it, and then wait until it's condemned and then come before the board and say, hey, nothing can be done now tear it down. I would like more guidance on that, because that just seems like we're letting them destroy a historical site because they neglected it.
And usually there is, we do put a section in for demolition by neglect. If that's something that the city that's a topic that comes up and the city,
It has a couple
handles,
times.
then we can absolutely put a demolition by neglect in there.
I think we need it.
And again, it's guidance. There's only so much that we can do. We can't force anybody's hand, but
Right.
if you have the guidance and you're making decisions based on a specific guideline, then it's better footing.
Anyone else? Do you have any more questions, comments?
Cindy does. Laura?
Okay. I think we can go
Cindy
ahead.
has a,
Huh? Let's open it back up to the public. Ms. Terrapini has something she would like to say, so let her come forward. Anyone else would like to speak after her? Let's try to keep it to a 4-minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Cindy Terrapini, 22 North Spring Boulevard. I was surprised by the 4-minute because we've never used that, so I didn't plan my presentation that way. I'm sorry, but two thoughts based on the comments that y'all had. Laura will probably remember, you might be the only one, I think Pat might have been on the board too, when the previous planner suggested doing a mail-out annually to everyone, all owners in the district. It's just a FYI, you're in the historic district, please go to the city's website if you're planning any changes. It was a real kind of simple thing. I think she was even proposing to do it on a postcard, because there's nothing that I'm aware of that requires a real estate agent to disclose that. It's not a disclosable item in Florida. So the only way people might know is if they look around, but the people that don't want to recognize it are not ever going to recognize it. So, you always have that problem. Then the only other thing I would say is about education, and Carrie Root mentioned it. The Florida Trust has an annual conference every year in May. It's always in Florida, big surprise, because it's a Florida organization. So usually you can drive to it, but I think the city really should consider, to be a CLG, it requires your board members as well as your staff to have experience and be educated on whatever the latest issues and topics and trends are. And I would suggest to you that you ask the city to pay for a certain number of people to go to that training every year, and kick in a little bit for mileage or something. I mean, share rooms if you like. Not all of you, but some of you might want to share rooms. But it's a really great way to get experience, and the best part is you meet other people who are doing the same thing you are, and you're going to learn just from talking to them as you're there. And then the other one is that group I mentioned to you guys when I was here last month, the National Association of Preservation Commissions has a fabulous website. It's NAPC, National Association of Preservation Commissions. And they really have some great educational material. I mean, it's sitting there reading it online. I appreciate that that's not as easy as going to a workshop, but it does have some good stuff. So just a couple extra thoughts for you. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jacob Carr. I reside at 146 Cleveland Place. I am also a city commissioner, but this isn't me as a city commissioner asking for anything to be done. This is just as a resident. I sat on your board for about 3 years, so I did see some curious applications come before us. And I just want to bring up a couple items maybe to look at as well. So growing up in the historic district, it was really a treasure being able to go in and out of all the old homes, crawling under the old homes and seeing what the foundations were made out of, and finding old bricks and old tree stumps and things along those lines that hold up the homes. But one of the things I know that came up was a driveway situation. And so like a circle drive, I think, isn't allowed in the code today. But with some of the issues with the road accesses and some other aspects, I think it would be something to at least look at and evaluate with the size of the vehicles and on how some of the roads are have a lot of extra, I guess, traffic going down these roads. So it's difficult to pull out onto, like, let's say, Spring Boulevard, for example. Another one was, if I remember correctly, and I don't recall if this is exactly how the code lies, but I believe if you wanted to put a wall in front of your house, it needed to match the building of your house itself. So if you have a wood house, it's going to be difficult to put a wood fence maybe. If you wanted maybe a brick fence that fits the area or an old stone fence, I would say if it fits the character of the neighborhood, I think that might be something you might want to evaluate. Because it's very restrictive. I suppose you could put a picket fence up, would be a wood fence, correct? But if you wanted a permanent fence, it would be very difficult to do that based on the guidelines today. One other one would be the building materials, and I know this is a sensitive subject, but being in Florida, and if you replace a wood on a siding of a house, let's say it's a pine, a fresh pine, we know that the pine that's relatively used today deteriorates much faster than maybe a cypress wood or a heart pine that was harvested maybe 100 years ago. I would like to see the ability to use hardy board at the bottom of the house to prevent if it's a moisture going up the side of the house, or because being in some of these houses, I've taken care of a lot of them, or some of them around the bayou, is you replace the pine wood, and then 5 years later you're replacing that same pine wood again, and it's painted. But a hardy board, if it's the same look, I think you have an opportunity to help preserve that look of the house itself. Now, I'm not saying the whole house should be hardy board, but I think it would be a good idea to at least evaluate that and see what other avenues there are, because Florida has such a unique climate, and I think it's important to keep the look of the house overall. So, but thank you for everything you're doing and your willingness to evaluate this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Anita Prost, 901 Bayshore Drive. Is our building director here? No. Other departments that have something to do with the historic district and our older homes? No. We should have a meeting like this and ask them to come, and the people in their departments, those who process permits, to understand what's going on. An example was I think it was the Fernal building uptown. One day I got a call, they're taking the windows out, the historic glass and all. I went up there and saw it and came here to the building department. I said, did this go in front of the Historic Preservation Board? I'm not going to name the name, but he said, we have a Historic Preservation Board here? And I said, you don't know you're head of a department here? That's not right. So our mayor's listening, maybe he can ask them to have a meeting so they can learn about all of this. That's very important. You need to read the rules and regulations, and you can get a copy of it from St. Augustine, Tallahassee, Thomasville, Georgia, and throughout Alabama and our southern states, what they have done for preservation of their homes and their buildings. Especially in St. Augustine, they've got a very strict one, and in Thomasville, Georgia, it's like the Gestapo there to preserve, because we are chipping away little by little of our historic. And not only is Tarpon one of the nicest historic towns next to St. Augustine, once it's gone, cannot be replaced. And we need to start acting very diligently and very demandingly of our brick streets, preserving what we have not only in the docks and in Greektown, but all over Tarpon Springs, so that we can be known as one of the leading historic preservation communities in the South. With what we have, can you imagine what Tarpon Springs would be like? We've lost too much already, and I thank y'all for having this board. I might not be able to stay for the whole meeting, but thank you for what you're doing. Join the historic preservation boards in the state of Florida, a wealth of knowledge. Take your trips. Once again, let's invite them down here to Tarpon Springs, the boards of the historic preservation. The city should be able to host them so they can see and help us here and help our rules and regulations and our permits. Thank you for what you're doing. The commission needs to learn to stand up behind you as the board to preserve what we have.
Thank you.
Otis, 538 West Cedar Street, Tarpon Springs. Just a comment, I just want to always put in a pitch for remembering Tarpon Springs and that the historic preservation guidelines and district is somewhat of a new generation thing. It didn't exist 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and many of the families that either built those homes or inherited it through their families still live there. And oftentimes they're not economically well off as many homes that you see remodeled today. And oftentimes it's not just meeting the historic preservation guidelines, but it's also satisfying the building code. Things can get very expensive. I live in Greektown, and I wanted to replace an old door on the front of our home. Now, I'm a retired PE, a structural engineer. And I spoke to Kevin Powell, who's an excellent building director, by the way, and he needed, it was an odd shape, just like many of the historic homes, they're not standard, and so I needed to order a door from Georgia, basically an old pine door with the look of the vernacular style homes that existed. The door was in there right now, was more of a Spanish style panel door. So he said I needed to get engineering on it. Fortunately, I contacted one of my friends who I turned over all my clients to after I retired, and he did the work for me on just as a professional courtesy. But just I think of the people that still live in the older homes that need to replace a window, glass, a door, and sometimes they have a hard time doing that. And oftentimes maybe code enforcement would come after them. Maybe times they are able to patch it together to keep it going. The one thing that I would like to ask the Historic Preservation Board, and I don't know whether this would be in your purview, certainly it would have to be approved by the Board of Commissioners, is to consider some kind of a needs-based grant for perhaps taking care of the homes. Maybe they would like to make an improvement, but they don't quite have the money to do it, but maybe a needs-based grant. We do that in the community redevelopment area. We have grants for facade grants. We're now talking about an interior grant. And I don't think it would be out of character for the community, at least some of the older families that could demonstrate that they have a need to perhaps offer some kind of a historic preservation grant to assist them in changing out a door or something to keep it historic that they couldn't otherwise afford. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to close the public comments. I have another thing that I would like to see in the guidelines. I don't even know it's possible, but I've heard people discuss, oh, we want to bring tiny houses in, or we want to build a parking garage and buildings above it, whether it be businesses or whether it be apartments. And I want to know what the guidelines are in putting that into a historic district, or does that need to go outside of the historic district? What is the guidelines for that? if they want to build a parking garage in the district or apartments on top of it.
So there is a section for new construction.
Okay.
And again, it's how to approach new construction. It's you know, you need to look at the setback, and it's similar to a zoning code. You look at the setback, but it should fit with the surrounding structures. Is the massing the same? Is the style somewhat similar? If you look around, is it gonna stand out like a sore thumb, basically, which is what you don't want? That's most of how new construction works in guidelines. Whether or not it's a tiny house, you know, is it a tiny house in a shipping container, or is it just a new tiny house that you're building from scratch
Right.
that can look like something that's around it, and, you know.
Could we possibly get some of that into our guidelines?
My
More detailed
hesitation-
information into it?
My hesitation of making it too specific is that gives people who don't want, or who aren't thinking of something like that, it gives them less of a,
Okay.
it gives you less of a ground to stand on when you make
Okay.
it so specific. But, I mean, once you see the document and how it comes together in the section about new construction, if you feel like something should be in there that needs to be tweaked to prevent things like that from happening, you know, we can go from there, but I wouldn't want to address
Okay.
specifically tiny
Thank-
houses
thank-
or
yes, thank you.
specifically parking garages.
Okay. I would agree with what I've heard here. I would like to see more workshops and more interaction between our different departments, the planning and zoning, code enforcement, and make sure everybody understands what our guidelines are and why we rule that way. And I think that would be very helpful for everybody.
Yes, and this update of the guidelines, as well as looking at your Article 7 of the Land Development Code,
Okay.
your Land Development Code section, that'll be coordinated with this update so that everything's consistent. We are going to be coordinating with all of the city departments, especially building, public works, project administration,
And code
on
enforcement.
those. Yeah, and code enforcement. Yeah, at some point, we'll probably, we'll be coordinating individually, but we'll also probably have some draft language or some issues for them at a technical review committee for them to look at. So we'll be sure and coordinate that among city departments.
Will the guidelines have anything that would involve the Heritage Board in some of the decisions to do that are not structural? Like the street signs that went up through the historic district, I heartily approve of them, but we had nothing to say about that or them. If they want to repave the streets in the historic district that are basically brick underneath and want to tar them over, do we have any input, or have we anything to say about it? I mean, this is historic too, the streets as well as the buildings.
Yeah, your guidelines do cite some of those public realm improvements or public realm features, some walls, granite curbs, brick streets, hexagon sidewalks. I mean, some of that stuff's in there. You do not have direct purview over those. As you know, your purview is over properties that are in the district and as they're designated. I'm sure in general, as we work through these guidelines, I'm sure the Board of Commissioners would appreciate any input or any ideas or guidance you may have for them on those issues. But yeah, those would be city projects in public realm, and those would not go through our review process here.
And they wouldn't have to notify us that they were even considering them.
Well, outside the regular notification that everybody gets of Board of Commissioner meetings, we usually don't. But like I say, might be something where you might want to look at, just your general, if you have general feeling about those types of public realm features in the historic district. What those are, we can certainly identify those in the guidelines. Some of them are in your current guidelines. I think there's a few things missing, you know, and you could look at those and certainly give some input on.
Yeah, what things do you see missing?
Well, I think the granite curbs are missing. There might be some other things. I don't know. It's
We
just,
include that into what we're,
I think you can talk about that. It's like the section, you know, we had this application at your last meeting about Spring Bayou, or that affected Spring Bayou in some people's minds. And your guidelines do refer to scenic views, but maybe those types of things, landscape views, scenic views that you think are important in the district. Those are things that you can talk about. You know, we have a tree ordinance. Trees are important. We have a pretty darn good tree ordinance. So I know there, maybe Sarah can comment, but I know there are cities that go you know, talk about historic trees and large trees and things. But you know, we're in pretty good shape with trees. But all that's part of the ambiance of the district. You guys have Purview, good example. A lot of times people would ask, well, why are we seeing signs? You see every sign that goes up in the historic district, whether it's a contributing, non-contributing property.
but not the historic signs that went up. We didn't see those, did we? Because I don't recall that.
Well, okay, on private property, no, your purview is not over city property.
It's on
Yeah.
private property.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you see all those signs. So that's the reason you do is to kind of review a consistency, a scale, a feel for the district, whether the property is historic or not. So those kinds of things we would like to get your input on.
Okay. So what's our next steps, Pat?
So as I mentioned, we're hoping to get you know, a good amount of comments, and this has been great tonight. In the next 3 weeks or so, Sarah and Caitlin are going to be. They've already started kind of outlining and scoping out the document, and they'll be coming up with sort of a draft.
What's that date, deadline again? February?
February the 21st.
Thank you.
Which is a Friday. So we're looking at approximately late April, mid to late April for a draft document for you all to look at.
Okay.
That's
And
kind of where
the
we're
draft
at.
document comes to us, and then what's that next step? Then we vote on that? Or how does that, this is
Well,
new to
that'll-
me, so you're going to have to kind of give me a little more detail.
Yeah, and yeah, I'll give you more update also at each of your meetings.
Okay.
But the way and see how it plays out. But yeah, you guys would look at it. We'll give it to you ahead of time. Give us your comments
Okay.
on that.
Anybody that publicly wants to give you any information, they can email that in to you, or they call, or what, if they want to?
Yeah, so then to finish that thought, then the document will go to the Board of Commissioners for them to
vote.
accept.
Okay.
Yeah, written comments are best. Email, you can bring them in if you, you know, have some, you can take one of the documents and mark it up, pages. We'll be glad to scan that in and make a copy for you. So any way you want to do it, that would be great. We'll take any kind of written comments.
Okay. And so once the Board of Commissioners has reviewed it and decided and voted, do we get notification of that, or we just need to
Yes.
check online and go to that commission meeting?
Well, we'll be letting you know about that meeting. And once they review it, then we will send it to the Department of State, and that will do it for us. So,
You want to go ahead and wrap up whatever else needs to be done on this, Pat? Do we have our presentation? They want to make any more comments, or?
Nope, we're good.
Okay,
All right.
you're good?
yes.
Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and adjourn, and I can't see the clock.
25
7:35.
Okay, we're going to open for public comment one more time.
Yeah, and while Anita's coming down, I should mention your next regular meeting is March the 2nd.
Okay.
That's a Monday. So again,
Urge you to come.
people that want to get an email update, give me your email so I can keep you updated on the list. And you can watch this meeting on TV to get an update then too.
We have an ordinance here in the city on the granite. You mentioned the granite. It's not being enforced. When they did the sidewalks down in Greektown, granite was thrown to the side. I know I personally called the city manager and told him, I said, at night, they're picking up the granite. People were picking up the granite, contractors were. The granite is supposed to be picked up by the city and stockpiled to put around the city on their curbing. They're not enforcing it. The signs should have come before this board of historic preservation, and they did not. You need to look into what ordinances they have on signs, streets, sidewalks, and look at what needs to be brought before the historic preservation in these areas. And if they don't have some of them, it needs to be done. That's what they're doing in historic communities throughout the United States. And like I said, get St. Augustine, get Tallahassee, get Thomasville, Georgia, get Atlanta. Look at the restrictions that they have. But we have some ordinances here, but they're not being enforced.
Any other comments before I close public comments? Pat, do you have anything else to add? Okay. We're going to adjourn the meeting now, and I think it's 7:40?
7.
7:35. Meeting adjourned. Can't see the